Welcome to Charts Today Energy. My name's David Linton, and today's edition for Thursday, the 11th of October, comes to you from London. And taking a look at markets in general first, the dollar is weakening this morning, the euro strengthening. Dollar very weak against the yen, being a flight to quality to the Japanese yen. Of course, the big story is stock markets falling very heavily. The NatGas down over 4% overnight. We've seen big falls in Asia and European markets this morning, stocks falling quite heavily. The standouts really are gold. The flight to quality of the yen, but overall markets are now looking pretty weak, and so that sentiment is filtering through to the energy mix. We're seeing Brent crude this morning sitting at 82.10. We were as low as 81.50 first thing this morning, so we have climbed back some of that gain, but we're short-term bearish. Medium term, we are still very bullish, and long term we've got upside targets. Still, that upside target of $94 sits there. We've got a new upside target to $122 off. This pullback that we've seen has locked this column. We'd have to go higher, so we'd have to break to new highs on Brent to activate that, but that's highly significant. And we're seeing here downside targets on the short-term chart to $80. So no, that's on the 1-minute chart. So at the moment, we do have a short-term bearish, long-term bullish picture. And looking at WTI, we're seeing much the same, of course. A bit of a climb this morning back to that sort of $72 level. We were as low as 71.80. Upside targets here of 11-12%. So oil still looking pretty bullish, although we're seeing that pullback on sentiment at the moment. US NatGas holding pretty sharp, strong, and one of the few products that's actually bullish on all three timeframes. We're still bullish in the short term. So that's looking good, and we're seeing here the correlations with crude oil, as we might expect, are pretty strong. So at the moment we're bullish on NatGas on all three time frames. We do have some short-term downside targets though to $3.10, $3.18, $3.19. So we might just see a pullback continue there, but the long-term targets are here to play for. So still looking pretty good. Taking a look at coal, coal prices falling quite heavily yesterday. That continuing on API 2 this morning, down 1.5%. So we are seeing that short-term bullish picture, and the correlation on the short term with crude is fairly neutral. Long-term correlations, of course, are still pretty good. We do have still big upside targets, but we now have some downside targets. 93.50 was given yesterday. That's where we are now, so that was met. 94.10, 95.10. So these targets were there, and we talked about those yesterday. Richards Bay also fell quite heavily yesterday, down some 4%. So we are still seeing that there. Of course, if you're on your Trayport screen, you'll have better data for coal. Looking at the emissions contract, we're seeing here we're down some 2.5% this morning. So that negative sentiment really filtering through. And we talked about downside targets yesterday. 1860 was the downside target. 1825 is not yet activated, but a move lower this morning would activate that. So we're seeing some moves there in emissions, and the correlation with crude is negative. As it's neutral. The chart is bearish on the short term, and with crude oil, the correlation is still there long term. Looking at MBP this morning, UK gas, we're seeing here we're bearish as well. We've got a new downside target of 61.50. That's some 10% lower. We'd need to make new lows to activate that. So keep an eye on those 1-minute charts for that. And again, if you're running on Trayport on your OTC data, you'll have many more targets on your screen. And looking at TTF also looking pretty bearish, so we're seeing gas prices just falling as we might expect, down 2% really on NBP and TTF. NCG down by a similar amount and looking pretty bearish. No clear downside targets on the short-term chart. 25 euros on the medium term, so a little bit further to fall, but certainly falling away there. And we've activated some quite big downside targets off this top, so it does look a little bit like a little head and shoulders there, with NCG just coming off the top. Italian gas not looking so bad this morning, but in terms of the fall, it's only down less than 1%, but looking pretty bearish as well. So Interestingly, we've got a downside target here, some 4% lower to 26 euros. Looking at power markets were holding stronger yesterday versus gas, but now we're falling away quite heavily. German power down 1.6%. The downside targets that were given in the last few days have been met. No new downside targets. A small upside target, some 1.6% higher, but not very convincing. Wait for big moves to give us the next targets there. Bearish in the short term, medium and long term still holding its bullish position, but for the moment, power prices looking pretty bearish. French power down just under 2% this morning, and we do have downside targets here of 44 and 50 euros and 44, so that's 10 and 20% respectively. Whether we'll see those moves will be key, but we are seeing gas prices, power prices just generally really pulling back off the top here. Nordic power really hit this morning, down 3.7%, so we are seeing big moves there. And if we look at Czech power, down some 4%, so we're seeing some quite dramatic moves in the power price. Italian power down 1.5%, and Polish power down just under 2%. So quite a lot of variation across the board. And again, if you're running Updata on your Trayport dual screen, you'll have a lot more targets to the downside. That's it for today. Until tomorrow, happy charting. See you then.